I just want to go over the outline of the day and then talk a little bit about some of the things that we're doing as a watershed network, that we're finding with our member surveys, and try to link that to the things that the panel is going to talk about today. So the morning, we're going to focus on roles and resources for watershed stewardship groups, sustainable funding. How do we, as watershed stewardship groups, work with others to make sure that we have long-term effective programs and projects? So thinking about what are sources of funds and resources, what partners might share some of our values and mission, and this is what the panels are going to talk about. So we're going to have, I'm going to start with an overview of what our members are doing. We're going to have the panel discussion with some new approaches, and then some small group discussion. Then we get lunch, which is good. Thanks to Bonnie and Randy for providing our fruit, our coffee, and our lunch. And in the afternoon, we're going to focus on water monitoring and then the role of community-based water monitoring in the region. So the two pieces. Martin Carver is going to present the work he's been doing with the Columbia Basin Trust, understanding basin water resources. Then we're going to, Kat is going to talk about some of the national work that she's been involved with community-based water monitoring. So try to get that relationship going. And then we have a set of discussions. What are the implications for the watershed network and our groups of those two pieces? And then Bonnie's going to close us out with what we learned. So that's the overall structure of the day. So I love it to have a smart board is it going to work? So in terms of what we were trying to get at with our member survey, we wanted to, again, just check in values and interests on our member groups in terms of check in on some of the things that we learned about sustainable funding from our member workshops last fall. So the member survey had some questions about that were testing the things that came out of our workshops about the issues that groups are having in terms of funding and resources. And I'm not going to talk too much about professional resources, but if you haven't filled out the member survey, it's still open, and so we're asking these questions, and then talk a little bit about partnerships and values and pass that over to the panel. So the first few things we did with our member survey are just like who's the watershed network really, what are our values, and what are we interested in doing. And this was on what physical aspects of watersheds do you currently spend the most time working and volunteering. So the watershed network members, I'm going to read these things because you can't read them. So water level, in other words, water quantity and quality are still where watershed network respondents spend most of their time working, volunteering, or learning, along with groundwater, wetlands, ecological health of water bodies, a little bit on aquatic invasive species, and very little on this particular species topics.
Jeremy, how many people responded to the survey?
We have 25 respondents. So, and only 10 responded as groups, because there's a set of questions for everybody, and then there's a set of questions specific to groups. So it's really just 10 groups, but 25 to this part.
Okay.
So in terms of, I just had a couple of things that I thought were interesting about this. In what type of watershed stewardship activities do you currently participate? Most of our respondents are definitely, welcome Kaylin. Can you grab an agenda and, and come on in.
Did you need to skip over question 2? I don't think you have a chance to talk to it.
I don't think. Okay, sorry. On what physical aspects of watershed would you most like to learn more, which is relevant to the watershed network? So our respondents would like to learn more about groundwater, still flow monitoring and water quality, wetlands, ecological health of watersheds. And we would like to learn more about some of the species issues, fish abundance and ecology, amphibian and reptiles, but really focusing on this sort of big picture ecological perspective. On what types of watershed stewardship activities do you currently participate? And this one, I think, really tells us something about who we are. By the way, these results are like hot off the press, so you're seeing it here first. So we currently participate in water quantity and quality monitoring, we volunteer with water stewardship groups. So about half of us participate in some kind of shared decision-making process. We attend watershed learning events, but we're not mapping land uses. Now I know this is, Richard must not have done this survey yet, but I think it's interesting that we're out there, you know, in the water, but we're not looking, so at least in this survey, we're not looking at what the impacts are to the watershed. So we're pulling the babies out of the stream, but we're not really looking at how the babies are being thrown into the stream.
Okay, so put 4% up.
Yeah, yes. So, and the other things that we're not as a group doing is we're not typically the people who are actually doing the building and trying to mitigate impacts. So that I thought was a good picture of who we are as a group. And it also gives the watershed network some clues about where we might start doing some outreach. Marty.
I just want to ask Richard or whoever who is doing this, if they've had any contact with the Nation. The reason why I'm asking is I sat on the water use planning. I used to work for the Canadian Intertribal Fisheries Commission, and I sat on the water use planning, and we did wildlife. We had a wildlife committee, lands and resources committee, cultural committee, and I'm quite sure I think the Nation has mapped out a lot of this, the land use.
I'd like to work with on that. Yeah. We are in Spokane, yeah, and tonight, yeah. We're in contact with them and working with them on a castle card. But since there's 3 different groups, we're trying to also connect with the other groups as well, because we might as well have input from all 3, because everybody used the valley as far as I can tell, because it was a big salmon. Thanks.
Yeah, just putting that out there, that the Nation, I think, has done a lot of work on the land use and the impacts. I myself was a hydro impact technician working for the Nation at the time. So.
And I don't think this reflects really what our members are doing across the board, because the Watershed Network supports our members with some mapping, and we help them with land use mapping. I thought this was curious in this, because 25 respondents is quite a few, but anyway, we're doing this. So we just to me it seems that we need to continue emphasizing this. What are the greatest challenges to healthy, sustainable watersheds? Climate change, residential and tourism development, some mining impacts, forestry impacts, and poor land use decision making as a thing in itself. In terms of the greatest challenges to successful watershed stewardship, this is one we're going to talk about a little bit more when we talk about funding and resources. But resources, this is resources for planning and assessment in terms of what issues are there to solve, was at this point seen as the greatest challenge to successful watershed stewardship by our respondents. And these others are sort of ways to collaborate and successfully organize within their group, finding resources, establishing partnerships, actually preventing impacts, which I always think is a kind of an efficient thing to do. And then addressing cumulative impacts. So our big ones are resources for planning and assessment and dealing with cumulative impacts, or what our members see as the greatest challenges. That was just in case I forgot what any of those ones were. So really this is consistent with this sort of checking in with the group on who we are and who we still are. These are consistent with our last couple of member surveys. We're interested in a variety of aspects of watershed stewardship. Water monitoring is a core interest for folks. Exactly how do you do this well? And we tend to be less interested in species-specific activities and more interested in habitats and wetlands. So more to the topic of the panel this morning, I wanted to just go through some of the specific things about what are the roles, what are the resources really, what are the position of member groups with resources, to the extent that we could learn this from our survey. And the reason that we surveyed this is our member groups told us in the workshops we did last fall that sustainable funding is an issue. Like, how do you actually do good work when your funding is coming in a year at a time is essentially the issue. So we framed some of our questions around that perception. So are our members grant-driven organizations? So if you read in the nonprofit literature, grant-driven organizations are ones that where the granting organizations drive the priorities. They're subject to 1 year granting. Grant-driven organizations are subject to what granting organizations are willing to do. So 1 year projects, subject to whoever's priorities, highly competitive, and sometimes the grantors are trying to distribute funds over an area rather than actually see results on the ground. And increasingly, we see our grantors that we deal with as watershed organizations in the Columbia Basin want us to have more than one grant at a time, so we're juggling dates and deadlines and reporting. So this is what we heard in the workshops and what we've talked about amongst each other. So what are our organizations dealing with on the whole? So first, what types of resources are we using? The map, so there's a very large proportion that is a combination of volunteer effort and grant-funded equipment and supplies. So we're doing, a couple $1,000s for a piece of equipment and lots of volunteer time. This is training provided by others. This is how much do we use this resource. And just plain donated equipment and supplies, which comes into partnerships. So all of this sort of area is the smaller project kind of terrain. It was surprising to me how many of my respondents were down here into the when you have a project funding a single grant funded project, multiple grants funding. So 70% of the groups that responded are actually running multiple grants and receive donations. So, but other sources of funds, which there's a certain problem in articulating what that is, but social enterprise, service provision, those kinds of things, long-term partnerships or contracts, our groups are not doing that kind of funding very much. So from this profile, we look fairly grant. We're in a very granting environment. So what are the expected problems from this? You have to have shovel-ready projects and less time spent on planning and assessment, and you have to have single-year projects. So yes, this is what our members are reporting, these kinds of issues. Yes, we're experiencing that we have to have shovel-ready projects and emphasis on restoration and less on planning and assessment. And so here's what that looks like. The greatest challenges, again, from our groups as well as our individual members, is that resources for planning and assessment, the research stuff, is the greatest challenge to find. Funding multi-year projects is challenging. And project funding for restoration and prevention or best practices project are the least challenged. I was actually quite surprised that groups did not report problems finding resources for grant administration. But, because I think that's very challenging.
Yeah, I agree.
So we're just, I think I'm just about, I just wanted, I think I have time to do the partnerships. Okay. So where are partnerships? Where are our members reaching out to partners in general? So the assumption here, or the idea, is that sustainable and reliable sources of funding typically flow to longer-term agreements, especially partnerships with government and industry. So where are our members seeking influence? Where are they communicating, and where are they participating? We had a series of questions addressing that. So at what scale would your group most like to influence decisions? This is not a surprising result. Municipal decisions and provincial decisions, with some interest in region and some wish to influence, like First Nations and federal decision making. But municipal, local, and provincial, because
It's interesting that there's no industry.
Isn't that interesting? We are not, as a whole, seeking to influence industry. Isn't that a weird result?
Because we know it's a moot point.
Does your watershed group communicate regularly with any of the following? We're on the phone to local government all the time. I'm just going to, is that correct, Jerry? Are we watershed stewardship groups? You hear from them? You hear from us? Yes. We communicate regularly with other non-government organizations, not very much with industry, and not very much with other. Why didn't I put the province on this? Why isn't the province on this? So hopefully it's in the results. And do you currently participate in any stakeholder planning groups where you have a seat at the table? And that's half and half. 50% of our groups are participating and 50% are not participating in stakeholder type processes, long-term discussion type processes. So most of our members would like to influence local and provincial decisions. Many of our members are in communication with local and provincial decision makers, only half directly participate in decision-making processes. So that's as much, I think, of the member survey results. So you'll have to watch our newsletter for the rest of the results in terms of what member groups are looking for in terms of professional resources is one of the other areas we asked questions about. And there's some other things that we'll be reporting on more. So with that, I was hoping, oh yeah, Avery, and sorry? I want 10 more groups to fill it out. So I'm going to get on the phone. So see if we can accomplish that in the next couple of weeks. Alan?
There's
Sorry.
quite a wide range in kind of groups in the basin, in the network, large and small. Is there any way to parse the data one by one?
Well, I have some questions that I need to go through in terms of, I asked some more detailed questions, or we did, I should say, in terms of distribution of funding, and I'm going to have to dig in and kind of pull out and see if we can sort of profile our because my sense is that we have some typical types of groups, so I'm going to have to dig in and do a little bit more work with the data. And so that's why I want 10 more groups before I start doing that. Bill?
I think this is rather important. Does any of this go forward to the granting agencies, or the British Columbia municipalities, or the regional districts for their information?
I think that's something that we're wanting to do. Check in with, we're part of the reason for trying to trying to get this information and frame it up in a way is because our members are wanting to talk to the granting agencies about the situation they're in. And I've had conversations with Jerry about this and some other people. But that's the intention. We don't have a specific plan yet in terms of how we roll it out. So.
Do you have a list of, it would be interesting to just see what all the people who fill it out, who they are. Like, or like how many, I don't even know, how many groups are a member of the Columbia Scholarship.
Well, there's about 50 groups that are members, and we have a pretty good list. It doesn't include, it's not totally updated. We have a pretty good list on the website. Okay. When I looked at the results, really? When I looked at the results, sorry, was this? We didn't agree on symbols. When I looked at the results, we have actually, it's pretty good distribution spatially about who's responded so far to the survey, but I don't think I can't really share which groups have responded to the survey, but I can see it, and I get on the phone to the other ones.
Yeah.
So